Her trunk had barely touched the platform boards at Far Junction before Clara Wynne saw the truth written plain across her betrothed's face. And it was not the face of a man overjoyed to see the woman he'd sent for arrive at last, after 1,100 miles of rail and dust. She had traveled 6 days by rail and 2 more by jolting stagecoach to reach this dusty platform, sleeping upright against hard seatbacks, subsisting on cold biscuit and lukewarm coffee bought at whistle stops, carrying in her small reticule the last of her savings, and tucked carefully beneath her good gloves, the letter in which Thaddius had promised to meet her train himself, however late it ran, because he could not bear to have her arrive in a strange territory without a familiar face waiting. She had read that letter so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, and she had believed every word of it until this very moment, standing amid the platform's dust and noise, with her whole future rearranging itself in front of her eyes. Thaddeus Corbin stood at the edge of the depot crowd with his hat in his hands, and beside him, close enough that their arms brushed with the easy familiarity of long habit, stood Clara's own cousin Selina, golden-haired and lovely, in a traveling suit finer than anything Clara owned, wearing on her left hand a wedding band that caught the afternoon sun and threw it straight into Clara's eyes like an accusation. "Clara," Thaddeus said her name the way a man says a word he wishes he didn't have to. "I wrote you a letter. It must have crossed you on the rails. Selina and I were wed a week past Tuesday." The platform seemed to tilt beneath her feet, though she knew well enough it was only her own legs threatening to give. She had crossed half a continent on the strength of his letters, had sold her mother's good silver to pay her fare, because his own promise to send for it had never come, had spent the whole rattling week of the journey imagining the small, dignified wedding they would have, the modest house he'd written of building. She had not imagined this. Her cousin's satisfied, faintly apologetic smile, the small crowd of Far Junction strangers turning to watch the spectacle with the frank curiosity of people who saw little enough entertainment out here to let a good scene pass unwitnessed. "I see," Clara said, because there was nothing else a woman could say with her whole life rearranged in the space of one sentence and half the town watching to see how she'd take it. "You mustn't think ill of either of us," Selina put in, drawing off her glove as if the matter were already settled and merely wanted smoothing over. "Thaddeus needed a wife who understood business, Clara, who could help him with the freight company's books and the social calls his new position requires. You were always better suited to quieter things. I'm sure you'll find someone who suits you fine back home." Back home. As though home were a place still open to her, as though she hadn't already given up the small teaching position she'd held for 6 years to come west on a promise now broken in front of a train platform full of strangers. As though the return fare she no longer possessed might simply appear from the dry Far Junction dust to carry her back to a life that had already closed its door behind her. "I don't have the money for a return ticket," Clara said, and hated that her voice shook saying it, hated more that Thaddeus had the grace to look briefly stricken, and then, worse, to look away. "I could perhaps," he began, reaching for his coat pocket, and Selina's hand closed over his wrist, light and proprietary. "We've our own household to think of now, Thaddeus," she said, sweet as poisoned sugar, and he let his hand fall still, and Clara understood in that moment precisely how much her cousin's marriage had already remade the man she'd once believed she knew. It was then that a stranger's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need raising to be heard. "Ma'am, looks like your trunk needs a wagon more than it needs an audience. I've got one hitched at the rail if you'll allow it." Clara turned to find a broad-shouldered man in a weathered hat and a coat gone soft with years of sun, watching the whole ugly scene with an expression that gave away nothing, except a plain, unhurried steadiness that felt, after the last 5 minutes, like solid ground. He was perhaps 35, sun-lined at the eyes, with the kind of quiet self-possession that made the depot crowd's whispering feel suddenly small and beneath notice. "I don't believe we've been introduced," she managed. "Wyatt Denholm. I run cattle out past the junction road." He didn't offer his hand, only tipped his hat, giving her the space to decide whether she wanted to be touched by any man's kindness today at all. "I came in for feed sacks and mail, and I find I've got room in the wagon bed and no particular hurry to be anywhere else this afternoon, if you'd rather ride out of this crowd's notice than stand here answering to it." Behind her, Thaddius was already steering Selina away, murmuring something about calling on the Wraith household before supper. And Clara understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the shock of it, that whatever life she traveled 1,000 miles to claim no longer existed, and that the only decision left to her was what to do with the one she had instead. "Thank you, Mr. Denholm," she said. "I believe I would." He loaded her trunk himself without being asked twice, and helped her up onto the wagon seat with a hand that was rough-palmed and entirely respectful. And they rode out of Far Junction's dusty square in a silence that Clara found, against every expectation, restful rather than awkward. "You're not from anywhere close," he said eventually, eyes on the road. "Ohio. I taught school there 6 years." She looked down at her hands, folded too tight in her lap. "I don't quite know what I'll do now, Mr. Denholm. I've no money, no position, and a cousin who's just married the man I crossed a continent to marry myself. Far Junction's been wanting a schoolteacher since the last one married off and moved to Prescott," he said, matter of fact, as if this were simply information rather than a lifeline he was extending with careful, deliberate casualness, so it wouldn't feel like charity. "Board's rough, but honest at the Widow Prute's place in town, and the school board pays modest but regular. I couldn't say if they'd take you on sight unseen, but I know Ezra Fenwick who chairs the board, and he owes me a favor or two." "Why would you trouble yourself over a stranger's misfortune?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer, and when he did his voice had gone rougher, as though the words cost him something to say aloud. "Because I watched a crowd of people I know by name stand there this afternoon and do nothing but stare, while a decent woman got handed the worst afternoon of her life, and it turned my stomach some, if I'm honest. Man ought to do something useful with a wagon and an idle afternoon besides haul feed sacks." It was not romantic, what he offered her, not yet, not by any measure Clara would have recognized as courtship. It was, instead, something steadier and rarer. A plain man's decision that a wrong done in his sight deserved some correcting, whatever it cost him in gossip or trouble. She found, riding beside him into the lengthening afternoon light, that she trusted the plainness of it more than she'd ever trusted Thaddius Corbin's pretty letters. Ezra Fenwick, when Wyatt brought her before the school board 2 days later, proved gruffly practical rather than warm. But the position was hers within the week, $12 a month and a roof at the Widow Prute's, enough to keep body and pride both intact, while she decided what came next for a woman whose whole planned life had collapsed on a train platform. She wrote her mother a careful letter that did not say everything, and began, slowly, to build a new ordinary life out of chalk dust and multiplication tables, and the particular satisfaction of watching a ranch child's face light with understanding. The children took to her quickly, in the unguarded way children have of judging character faster and more truly than their elders. The Holly's boy, who'd struggled with his letters since the last teacher gave up on him as simple, proved instead merely frightened of failing in front of older cousins, and softened considerably once Clara took the trouble to sit with him alone after lessons and let him find his own pace toward the alphabet. The Fenwick girls, prim and watchful daughters of the board chairman, tested her patience and her authority both in the first fortnight, until Clara held firm enough on both counts that they settled, grudgingly at first, and then genuinely, into respecting her. Not everyone in Far Junction welcomed a stranger's swift rise from jilted spectacle to respectable schoolteacher, however. Iris Cobbett, whose father ran the livery and who had, by her own account, and everyone else's quiet agreement, set her sights on Wyatt Denholm some 2 years prior without ever quite securing his attention, made her displeasure known in the particular sideways manner of a woman, unwilling to say plainly what she meant. "It's a wonder," Iris remarked to a knot of other women outside the mercantile, pitched just loud enough to carry to where Clara stood waiting her turn at the counter. "How quick some women manage to land on their feet when a body considers how they arrived in the first place." Clara said nothing in reply, only paid for her thread and her flour and walked out with her chin level, having learned already, in 6 years of teaching other people's children, that the surest answer to unkindness was simply to go on living well in spite of it. Wyatt Denholm called at the schoolhouse more often than strictly necessary for a man with no children of his own to educate, bringing firewood before the board thought to send it, mending a broken step before she'd finished mentioning it troubled her, standing at the back of the room some Fridays to hear the children recite, hat in his hands, watching Clara with an attention he seemed at pains to disguise as simple neighborliness and failed, increasingly, to disguise at all. "You've no family here to look in on things for a widower rancher," his Aunt Delphine told him plainly one Sunday, when Clara had come to supper at his invitation and caught the older woman's shrewd, approving eye upon them both. "I'll not pretend I don't see what's happening, Wyatt Denholm, and I'll not pretend I mind it either. That Corbin man was a fool 3 times over, once for the choosing and twice for not knowing what he'd lost." "Aunt Delphine," Wyatt said, coloring slightly, and Clara, for the first time since the depot platform, laughed without any bitterness threaded through it at all. The autumn harvest social, held that year in the newly raised Grange Hall at the edge of town, gave Far Junction its first real opportunity to watch Wyatt Denholm and Clara win together in public, rather than merely speculate about it from a distance. And watch they did, with the frank, unhurried interest of a community that had little enough novelty to occupy a Saturday evening. Wyatt came for her at the Widow Prout's in a coat she'd never seen him wear, looking so plainly uncomfortable in it that Clara laughed before he'd even reached the porch steps. "Aunt Delphine's doing," he admitted, tugging at the collar. "She said a man escorting a lady to a social oughtn't look like he'd come straight from mending fence, though I'll admit I'd be considerably more comfortable if I had." The hall was strung with dried corn husks and lantern light, and the fiddler struck up reels older than most of the families dancing to them, and Clara found herself, for the first time since the depot platform, simply enjoying an evening without the weight of grief or humiliation pressing at the edges of it. Wyatt danced without particular grace, but without any false modesty about the lack of it either, and held her hand between reels with a plain warmth that asked nothing more of her than her company. Iris Cobbett watched them from across the hall with an expression she made no great effort to soften, and cornered Clara near the cider table before the evening was through. "You've charmed him quick, for a woman not 3 months in town," she said, sweet-voiced and sharp-eyed both. "I do wonder what he'll think when the shine wears off a pretty sad story, and he's left with just you, plain school-teacher, same as any other." "Then he'll think whatever's true, Miss Cobbett," Clara answered steady. "Same as I hope he'd think of any woman, pretty story or none. I've found Wyatt Denholm judges people by what they do rather than what's said of them, which is a rarer quality in this territory than I once believed, and one I mean to go on being grateful for regardless of who minds it." She walked away from the cider table with her back straight, and if her hands trembled slightly with the effort of the composure, she made certain no one in the hall was close enough to see it. Wyatt found her by the door a few minutes later, having watched the exchange from across the room without hearing a word of it, and studied her face with the particular attentiveness of a man who'd learned already to read her moods. Iris again. She's not wrong to wonder, Clara said. I am a plain schoolteacher with a sad story, Wyatt Denholm, and no fortune or family standing to recommend me beyond it. I've never once in my life wanted a woman for her fortune or her family standing, he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it over the fiddle music, and I'll thank Iris Cobbett to mind her own dance card and leave mine be. He held out his hand for the next reel, and Clara took it, and found she no longer cared what the watching hall made of the two of them together. It was Selina, 3 weeks into Clara's new position, who brought the first real trouble to her door, arriving at the schoolhouse on a Saturday under pretense of inspecting the children's progress on behalf of her new husband standing in the community. Though Clara understood within a minute that the visit had nothing to do with arithmetic. You've done rather well for a woman with nothing, Selina observed, walking the narrow schoolroom aisle with a proprietary air that made Clara's jaw tighten. A position, a roof, and I hear Wyatt Denholm calls on you regular. You always did have a talent for making yourself useful to whoever would have you. I have a talent for honest work, Selina, which is more than some can claim. Selina's smile thinned. My father-in-law tells me Denholm's ranch carries an old note at the bank, going back to his father's time. Papa Wraith's bank, as it happens. Did you know that? Thaddius has gone into partnership with him now, the freight company and the bank both, and there's talk of a rail spur coming through the valley that would want the water rights along the junction road something fierce. It would be a shame, she said, drawing her gloves back on with unhurried satisfaction, if a note like that came due before its proper season, on account of a man's poor judgment in the company he keeps. It was not subtle, and Clara understood it was not meant to be. Selina had never possessed the patience for true subtlety. She had only ever needed enough charm to get what she wanted and enough cruelty, when charm failed, to make certain others paid for standing in her way. Are you threatening Mr. Denholm's livelihood, Selina, because he was kind to me on a train platform? I'm simply telling you what I've heard, Selina said, sweet as ever, and left Clara standing in the empty schoolroom with a cold new fear settling where her anger had briefly warmed her. She told Wyatt that evening, walking with him along the fence line after supper at Delphine's table, watching his jaw set hard as she relayed Selina's words. There's a note, he admitted finally. My father took it out the year of the bad winter, when we lost near half the herd and needed feed money to see the rest through till spring. I've been paying it down steady 8 years, but it's not near clear yet, and if Silas Wraith wanted an excuse to call it early, the bank's charter gives him the right, provided he can show cause. A missed payment. An irregularity. Something a determined man could manufacture easy enough if he wanted the water rights bad enough. And I hear that rail spur talks same as everyone in the valley does. Because of me, Clara said quietly. Because Selina's jealous of a schoolteacher with nothing to her name, and her husband's new father-in-law would sooner ruin an honest rancher than let his son-in-law's pride go unsatisfied. Because Silas Wraith has wanted my water rights since before either of us was born, Clara, and needed only an excuse he didn't yet have. You've given him nothing he didn't already want to take. He stopped walking, turned to face her fully in the last gold light of evening. I'll not have you carrying guilt for another man's greed. Whatever comes of this, it was coming regardless. But it came faster than either of them expected. Within a fortnight, a letter arrived at the Denholm ranch bearing the bank's seal, informing Wyatt that certain irregularities had been discovered in the note's original terms. a signature improperly witnessed, a clause open to dispute, and that the full balance would be called due in 30 days unless the matter could be satisfactorily resolved. 30 days to raise a sum that would have taken years of careful saving to accumulate honestly, or else lose land his father had broken to the plow with his own 2 hands. The town, predictably, began to murmur. Some said Denholm had always run his books loose. Others wondered aloud whether taking in a jilted stranger with no name or fortune to recommend her had been the poor judgment that finally caught up with a man who'd always seemed too sensible for such foolishness. Clara felt the weight of every whispered word as if it had been aimed at her directly, because in her heart she believed it had. Wyatt spent the better part of a week riding to every neighboring ranch along the valley, hat in hand in a way that plainly cost his pride, asking whether the other outfits might pool together enough to cover the note's worst of it, until he could refinance proper through a bank in the territorial capital. Some, like old Amos Ketterling, offered what they could without hesitation, remembering some decades-old kindness Wyatt's father had shown in a hard winter of his own. Others hedged, unwilling to cross a man like Sela's Wraith who held notes on half their own outfits besides, however uneasy the whole business made them. By the end of the week, Wyatt had raised perhaps a third of what the note demanded, generous by any neighborly measure, and nowhere near enough to matter against a deadline that would not bend for goodwill alone. "It's more than I expected, and less than I need," he told Clara plainly, the two of them walking the fence line in the blue hour before full dark, the same stretch of ground where he'd first taken her hand across Delphine's table. "I'll not pretend otherwise to you. 30 days was never a fair fight, Clara, not against a man who owns the very bank calling the debt due." "Then we'll find another way," she said, though she could not in that moment have said what that way might be, only that she had already decided she would not stand by and watch him lose everything to a scheme built on nothing but his own decency and her cousin's spite. "I did not cross a continent and lose everything I thought I wanted only to watch the one good thing that came of it taken from a man who never asked for anything but a fair chance." "You didn't cause this, Clara." "I know that," she said, "but I mean to help end it all the same." She did not yet know, walking that fence line with the day's last light fading gold behind the ridge, that the answer would come to her 2 nights later through nothing more than the thin plank wall of a schoolhouse office, and a banker's own careless confidence that no one was listening. "I should leave Far Junction," she told Wyatt, 3 days into the 30, sitting stiff and miserable at Delphine's kitchen table, while the older woman pretended great interest in her mending. "If my presence is the excuse Wraith needed, then my absence might yet remove it." "It wouldn't," Wyatt said, flat and certain. "A man like Sela's Wraith doesn't need a true excuse, Clara, only a plausible one, and he'll find another soon enough if this one walks out of town. I'll not have you running from a fight that was never rightly yours to carry, same as I told you before." He reached across the table, and for the first time took her hand outright, without the careful distance he'd kept between them since the depot. "I'd rather lose the ranch with you still in Far Junction than keep it by driving you out of it." It was Thaddius, of all people, who came to her 2 days later with an offer that revealed, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly how small a man he'd let himself become. He found her alone at the schoolhouse after the children had gone, turning his hat in his hands with the same nervous habit she remembered from their courting days back in Ohio, before distance and Selina's charms had remade him into someone she barely recognized. "I've brought you something," he said, and set an envelope on her desk, thick enough that she knew without opening it what it must contain. "Enough for a ticket home, Clara, and a little besides to see you settled. I know I owe you more than money can pay, but it's what I have to offer, and I'd rather you took it and went somewhere Selena's temper can't reach you, before this business with the Denholm note turns any uglier than it already has." Clara looked at the envelope a long moment, and then at the man who'd once written her letters full of a future that had never been meant to include her at all. "You'd pay me to disappear, Thaddius, the same way you'd pay off any debt grown inconvenient. I don't want your money. I never wanted anyone's money. I wanted a life built honestly beside a man who kept his word, and I've found that now, no thanks to you, and I'll not be bought out of it to spare your wife's vanity or your father-in-law's greed. You don't understand what Wraith's capable of when he's crossed. I understand exactly what he's capable of, because you and Selena between you have shown me plainly enough. What I don't understand, Thaddius, is how a man raised decent lets himself become an errand boy for his own wife's cruelty." She pushed the envelope back across the desk, unopened. "Take your money home. I'll make my own way, same as I've been doing since the day you showed me precisely what your promises were worth." He left without another word, and Clara sat alone in the empty schoolroom a long while afterward, shaking with an anger that felt, for the first time since the depot platform, entirely clean and entirely her own. It was 2 nights before the note's 30 days expired that Clara, staying late at the schoolhouse to grade arithmetic slates by lamplight, overheard through the thin wall separating the schoolroom from the small side office Ezra Fenwick used for board business, a conversation that changed everything. Sela's Wraith himself had come calling on Fenwick, believing the building empty, and his voice carried plain enough through the plank wall that Clara, frozen at her desk, heard every damning word of it. The Denholm note's witness signature was never irregular at all, Wraith was saying, low and satisfied. "I paid the county clerk $15 to swear otherwise, same as I'll pay you 20 to certify the bank's charter gives me cause when the 30 days runs out. There's a rail company survey crew coming through in the spring, Fenwick, and I mean to own every foot of water frontage between here and the Junction Road before they arrive, Denholm's included. A man doesn't get rich in this territory, waiting on other men's honesty." Clara did not wait to hear Fenwick's answer. She was out the schoolhouse door and running for the Denholm ranch before she'd fully decided to move at all, arithmetic slates abandoned, lamp left burning behind her, her whole body carrying the plain, unshakable knowledge that she alone, in all of Far Junction, now held the proof that could save the man she loved. She reached the ranch out of breath, her skirts torn from the fence line she'd climbed rather than waste time finding the gate, and found Wyatt on the porch in the last light, his face already carrying the particular stillness of a man who had made his peace with losing everything and was only waiting now for the hour to arrive. "Clara." "The note was never irregular," she said, gasping the words out between breaths. "I heard it myself. Not an hour past, Wraith paid the county clerk to falsify the witness question, and he means to buy Fenwick's certification too, all of it to clear the water rights before a rail survey comes through in spring. I heard him say it plain, Wyatt, with my own ears, through the schoolhouse wall." Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before, not merely hope, but the fierce, sudden clarity of a man who understood he had a weapon now, where a moment before he'd had only despair. "Would you swear to what you heard, before the board, before the bank examiner, if it came to that?" "I would swear to it before God and every soul in this territory," Clara said, "because I have spent my whole life being the woman things happen to, Wyatt Denholm, and I find I am done with that particular arrangement. Let me be the woman who does something, for once, that actually matters." They rode into Far Junction together at first light, and by mid-morning, Clara Wynne stood before the assembled school board and 2 hastily summoned bank examiners from the territorial capital, her voice steady though her hands shook at her sides, and repeated every word she had overheard through that thin plank wall. Ezra Fenwick, cornered and pale, broke within minutes of the examiner's first sharp questions, and admitted, in a stammering rush that clearly cost him what remained of his dignity, that Silas Wraith had indeed offered him money to falsify the note standing, and that the county clerk, once summoned, confirmed the same corruption with considerably less shame than either man deserved to be shown. For one unsteady moment, midway through the examiner's questioning, Clara's voice caught, and her hands went cold at the sheer weight of every eye in the room fixed upon her. The same room, she realized with a jolt, where she'd once stood before this same board pleading her case for a position she desperately needed, though then she had been asking for charity, and now she was delivering a reckoning. She found Wyatt's eyes across the room, steady and certain, and something in his plain, unwavering confidence in her steadied her voice enough to finish what she'd started. Silas Wraith, confronted in the bank's own lobby with his own scheme laid bare before witnesses enough to end any hope of denial, turned first to bluster, and then, seeing the examiner's faces, to a silence that was its own confession. Thaddius, standing beside his father-in-law with Selina's hand tight on his arm, would not meet Clara's eyes at all, and she found she did not need him to. "You'd have ruined an honest man's ranch and his father's legacy both," she told Wraith, before the gathered crowd that had once watched her humiliation on a depot platform, and now watched instead the unraveling of the men who'd caused it, to clear ground for a railroad that hasn't even confirmed its route. "I hope the profit was worth the shame, Mr. Wraith, because it's the only thing you'll be keeping out of this business." The note was voided within the week, the bank's charter itself under territorial review for the fraud its own president had orchestrated, and Wyatt Denholm's ranch stood exactly where his father had built it, free and clear, water rights intact, while the whole of Far Junction watched the woman once jilted on their own train platform walk out of the bank on the arm of the rancher, who'd offered her a ride when no one else in that crowd had thought to. He asked her that same evening, on the porch where Delphine had first guessed the truth of things before either of them dared say it aloud, with the last light going gold, and soft over the fence line, Clara had once torn her skirts climbing in a desperate hour. "I've no pretty letters to offer you, Clara Wynne," Wyatt said, turning a small ring over in his rough fingers, plain gold, nothing like the fine bright band Selina wore with such satisfaction. "Only a ranch that near got taken from me twice, once by a banker's greed and once, I'll admit, by my own fear of asking a woman better than I deserved to stay in a place that offered her so little to start with. But I love you, plain as I know how to say it, and I'd be glad the rest of my days to make sure you never again stand anywhere with nothing, not while I've a wagon and a roof and a heart that's already yours. You gave me a ride when my whole life had just collapsed on a train platform, Wyatt Denholm," Clara said, taking the ring from his hand before he'd fully finished offering it. "And you never once asked what it would cost you to keep offering me kindness after that, even when it very nearly cost you everything you owned. I don't need pretty letters. I had those once, and they were worth exactly nothing when the man behind them was tested. I'll take a plain man who stayed, every time, over a fine one who never did." She slid the ring onto her own finger before he could finish the fumbling job of it himself, and laughed, warm laughter this time, when he looked so plainly startled by her taking the matter into her own hands that Delphine, watching from the kitchen window, laughed along with her. Word of it reached Selina before the week was out, carried by the same gossip that had once carried news of her own wedding, and Clara heard, second-hand and without any particular satisfaction, that her cousin had taken the whole business badly, though whether from any real feeling for Thaddius or simple fury at having lost the last word in their long rivalry, Clara found she no longer cared to guess. She had crossed a continent once believing her whole future rested on one man's kept promise, and had learned instead, on a dusty depot platform, and in the 30 desperate days that followed, that the truest promises were the ones a person proved rather than merely wrote, and that a woman left with nothing could still, if she was steady enough and brave enough, build something worth every mile of the journey that had brought her to it. Iris Cobbett, to her credit, sought Clara out herself before the season turned, finding her one afternoon at the Mercantile and offering, stiffly but sincerely, something that passed for an apology. "I said an unkind thing or two about you this autumn, Miss Wynne, and I'll own it plain. I was jealous of a happiness I'd wanted for myself and didn't get, and that's no excuse, but it's the truth of it." Clara, who had learned a great deal that year about the difference between cruelty nursed and cruelty regretted, accepted the words in the spirit they were offered, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that Far Junction had room enough in it for more than one kind of forgiveness. They married that autumn at the same schoolhouse where she'd first begun to build her new life, the desks pushed back against the walls, and the children's own paper garlands strung from the rafters at their insistence. Ezra Fenwick, chastened but grateful for the leniency the examiners had shown him in exchange for his testimony, standing witness alongside Delphine, and half of Far Junction crowded into the little building to see the woman they'd once watched jilted in public claim, at last. A love that had been offered freely and kept faithfully from the very first afternoon. A stranger's wagon had rolled up beside her ruined hopes and carried her, quite without either of them knowing it yet, straight toward home. Clara wore no fine traveling suit, no lace finer than her cousin's, only a plain blue dress she'd sewn herself by lamplight, and thought, standing before the whole gathered town with her hand in Wyatt's steady one, that she had never in her life felt more richly dressed.